Now, equal education researcher Kimberley Khumalo now joins us via video link to weigh in on the issue of overcrowding in schools and the impact it has on learning. Kimberley, good afternoon, and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC at this hour.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
For context's sake, what is school overcrowding in a South African context? According to your research, what are some of the worst affected provinces as we speak?
Okay, so there's a very big difference between what we have seen school overcrowding to be versus what the Department of Basic Education says that it is. So from their end, they use measurements that detect overcrowding in schools in terms of the learner to teacher ratios. So essentially one teacher for every 40 learners, as well as looking at how much space a classroom has for the number of learners that it can hold. So we think that this measurement is too simple and doesn't really adequately deal with the issue of overcrowding, as it doesn't consider important factors such as the school building capacity, so the capacity of the school is in its entirety, the workload of the teachers in the schools, as well as other infrastructure like pollution facilities, water facilities, things like school halls and so forth. And secondly, we believe that the department tends to only measure school resources using school-wide averages, which tells us nothing about what individual classes look like. So, for example, not all teachers are teaching at all times, and learners are split unevenly between classes, especially in instances where they are more popular subjects. So overcrowding needs to be looked at way more holistically. But what we do see from the data that we are getting from the Department of Basic Education is that this is a struggle in urban areas in almost every province. So we started our research basically in the province of Gauteng, and then we're seeing more and more issues come from Western Cape and even more urban areas within historically rural provinces such as the Eastern Cape and Limpopo. So it is really a countrywide issue.
Thank you for setting that context for us. So according to your definition, what then leads to overcrowding? And when we look at the effects that it has had, walk us through that, perhaps on a behavioral, environmental, and psychological front. So
we looked at three main causes of overcrowding. So one of them is definitely a shortage of teachers, and we know that the basic education budget is shrinking and there isn't enough funds to allocate the number of teachers that are needed. But we do argue that teachers and school support staff need to be distributed more equally to schools, particularly to schools that need them more, which are under-resourced schools that can't compete with schools that are paying teachers way more. There's also a shortage of infrastructure. So thinking about classroom buildings, yes, but not limiting it to just that. So providing mobile classrooms alone cannot assist the issue. As we saw in the previous story, there are some issues that come with these mobile classrooms. So they are more vulnerable to climate shocks, for example. When it's hot, when it's cold in those classrooms, which makes teaching and learning very difficult to continue. And there are also gaps in the way the norms and standards for school infrastructure think about this, in that it only helps us think about the teacher to learner ratio as well as the physical space where learners must learn. But if the teaching and learning cannot continue because of the number of learners in a classroom at any given time, then obviously that means that the class is overcrowded. And also we're seeing issues with school autonomy. So schools can't necessarily adapt to have more learners or to turn learners away, especially if they're under-resourced, because they can potentially have their resources taken away. So we've seen teachers being taken away from schools because under-resourced schools were simply saying we can't take in more learners. And in terms of the effects of overcrowding, last year we took out a report titled Schooling Under Unusual Conditions, Research into How School Infrastructure Shapes Teaching and Learning in South Africa. That takes a look at the relationship between physical conditions of a school environment and teaching and learning. And what we found is that overcrowded classrooms make it more likely that teachers and learners are regularly absent from school, so they miss out out on key teaching time, and having poor school infrastructure entirely affects the quality of teachers teaching and their general attitude towards their jobs, which then in turn affects the learning process as well.
All right, Kimberley, thank you for that, because now as we look at some of the strides that have been taken, what comes to the fore? But if we're going to look at improvements as well within the confines of the existing model, what are some of those recommendations coming through as we speak?
So as Equal Education, we really think there are some solutions to this that provincial education departments, along with the Department of Basic Education, haven't quite zoomed into. So firstly, we asked that an infrastructure development plan at a provincial level be adopted, which prepares for the growth of the learner numbers in schools, particularly in more urban areas. We know that population can be tracked, and there are better ways to track it than what we've seen government do so far. So tracking that population growth, understanding 5-10 years ahead where learners are likely to go, and then building infrastructure that adapts to that. We also know that there's an issue with budget, but we are saying that money must be spent wisely. There are repeat offenders when it comes to wasteful and irregular expenditure in provincial education departments. So we want to see money actually being spent, and for good reason, and prioritized for schools that need it the most. We also ask that the Department of Basic Education come up with school capacity norms, which can limit the number of learners that go into schools, and therefore assist schools that are more pressured to be overcrowded to be able to simply say no, and to have some school autonomy. We also ask that teachers and support staff be placed in schools that need them the most and distributed accordingly. So we are currently seeing that the money factor plays a lot in terms of where teachers are allocated, but we're saying that really schools that are under-resourced need these teachers most, and their schools have the most overworked teachers, and therefore that's where they should go.
Which also shines a spotlight on teachers and their role and the amount of stress that they're also having to deal with, given the under-resourcing and the scenarios on the ground. I'm going to have to leave the conversation there, but thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour. Kimberley Khumalo is from Equal Education, weighing in on the issue of overcrowding in South African schools, the implications and some of the recommendations available at this point to the provincial department, to the provincial government and the Department of Education. Some of those recommendations that they have put forth at this hour to mitigate against those challenges.